What if the reason you avoid making new choices isn't fear, but exhaustion? In a world that demands decisions all the time, the mind learns to protect itself the only way it can. It repeats familiar paths, recycles habits, and chooses what's known, not because it's better, but because it hurts less to think. This isn't chronic indecision or a lack of ambition. It's mental overload. It's the quiet psychology of someone who has already decided too much, given in too much, adapted too much, and now just wants a bit of inner silence. On the outside, everything seems to work. The routine keeps moving, the safe choices repeat themselves, the day runs on autopilot. But inside, there's a kind of tiredness that's hard to explain, an invisible resistance to anything new, as if every extra decision feels like too much weight. The mind isn't confused. It's full of stimuli, expectations, pressure, and micro-decisions no one else ever sees. And that's exactly where something interesting happens. Avoiding choices starts to feel like rest. But what that really means for your mind and for your life is what we need to look at now. Before we keep going, let me ask you something simple, but important. If at any point you felt this mental tiredness, this urge to keep everything the same, just so you don't have to make one more decision, give this video a like right now. It helps it reach other people who might be living through that same quiet exhaustion. And leave a comment below if you've been there too. Even if it's just "I've felt this" or "this makes sense to me." Sometimes writing it down is the first way to ease the weight the mind has been carrying on its own. And if this kind of reflection speaks to you, if you feel like these videos put words to things you've never quite known how to explain, consider subscribing to the channel. Not to collect videos, but to keep this conversation going. Because what looks like simple tiredness often hides deeper psychological patterns, and understanding that can completely change how you see your own choices. There's a very specific kind of relief that almost no one notices when it happens. It's not joy, it's not real rest, it's not happiness. It's that quiet inner exhale that comes when you decide not to decide anything anymore, when you choose the same outfit, the same route, the same order, the same show, the same kind of conversation. In that moment, the mind isn't running away from life, it's trying to survive it. Because every new choice demands emotional energy, attention, comparison, risk, and when the mind is saturated, even good possibilities start to feel threatening. The psychology behind this is quiet, but powerful. The brain learns very quickly that what's familiar costs less. It understands that repeating patterns reduces friction, lowers mental effort, and creates an artificial sense of control. This isn't laziness, it's emotional budgeting. It's the mind saying, "I don't have the resources right now to evaluate one more option." That's why avoiding choices starts to feel like legitimate rest, a refuge, a place where nothing has to be decided, weighed, or defended. The problem is that this relief comes with something almost invisible, an inner shrinking. At first, the person doesn't notice it. They just feel less desire to try new things, less curiosity, less openness. Everything becomes more predictable, more safe, and strangely heavier. Routine turns into a shelter, but also a boundary. And the more the mind associates novelty with exhaustion, the more it convinces itself that staying where it is the only way to keep functioning. If any of this feels familiar to you, it might be worth writing a simple word in the comments, like exhausted or "I get it." Naming this state can change how much weight it carries inside. Maybe the most confusing part of all this is believing the mind is messy, when in reality it's just overloaded. There's a huge difference between mental confusion and mental saturation, but almost no one is taught to tell them apart. Confusion happens when information is missing. Saturation happens when there's been too much information, too many decisions, too many adaptations. The mind isn't lost, but it's tired. And when psychological fatigue sets in, the priority stops being choosing well and starts being choosing less. That's why, during periods of emotional exhaustion, even simple questions can feel irritating. Not because they're hard, but because they require one more act of evaluation. Psychology calls this decision fatigue. Every small choice consumes cognitive energy. Throughout the day, that energy gets drained by responsibilities, expectations, comparisons, and internal and external pressure. By the time evening comes, or by the time you reach that invisible point of saturation, the mind doesn't want answers. It wants quiet. And to create that quiet, it starts rejecting the new. New choices mean New risks, new chances to get it wrong, new potential frustrations. So the brain activates an emotional protection mechanism. Avoid, delay, repeat. This isn't weakness, it's psychological survival. The problem is that when mental saturation becomes a pattern, a person starts living as if they're always conserving energy, always at their limit, always bracing for a strain that never quite arrives, or that may have arrived a long time ago. At some point in this process, something subtle happens. Without the person even realizing it, repeating choices starts to create a sense of control. Not real control, but enough to calm an overloaded mind. When everything around you feels like it's asking too much, choosing the same thing over and over becomes a way of shrinking the world. Fewer options, fewer variables, less emotional risk. Psychology calls this defensive automation, but in practice it's simple. The mind builds shortcuts to keep itself from collapsing. Repeating the same pattern becomes comforting because it removes the need to think, and at that stage thinking hurts. Every new choice carries the possibility of getting it wrong, of regret, of spending energy that just isn't there anymore. So the brain starts associating what's familiar with safety and what's new with threat. Not because the new is bad, but because it demands mental presence. It demands attention, evaluation, comparison. It demands being fully there. Slowly, life starts to feel too predictable. Routines become rigid. Decisions get made on autopilot. And that creates a dangerous illusion, the feeling that everything is under control, when in reality, control is only being used to avoid feeling, to avoid fatigue, frustration, doubt, fear. The person doesn't realize they're not choosing from clarity, but from exhaustion. And the more the pattern repeats, the harder it becomes to break, because the brain learns that thinking less feels like surviving better. If this idea hit you in any way, you might want to leave something simple in the comments, like, "I'm on autopilot," or "This feels like me." Putting it into words is already a way of bringing awareness back into the process. Over time, this protective mechanism starts to come at a cost that almost never shows up in obvious ways. There's no breakdown, no clear crisis, no moment that screams, "Something is wrong." What exists instead is a quiet thinning of experience. The person keeps functioning, keeps meeting responsibilities, keeps making minimal decisions, but feels that something is slowly moving farther away. Psychology shows that when we avoid choices because of mental saturation, we don't just avoid effort, we also avoid the possibility of expansion. That's where one of the most dangerous effects of this pattern appears. Nothing gets dramatically worse, but nothing truly gets better either. Life slips into a state of constant maintenance. The mind, busy conserving energy, starts rejecting anything that requires emotional growth, adaptation, or vulnerability. New experiences feel exhausting before they even begin. New opportunities sound like weight. New decisions feel like unnecessary risk. And without realizing it, the person starts confusing stability with stagnation. The brain, which at first was only trying to ease mental overload, learns a habit, avoidance. And that habit spreads. It avoids difficult conversations, avoids small changes, avoids choices that could bring meaning. The result isn't immediate pain, but a gradual emptiness. A strange sense that days pass without leaving a mark. That time keeps moving, but something inside has stayed still. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to notice when protection turned into a prison, when rest turned into resignation, when control turned into limitation. There comes a point when the mind starts sending clearer signals that something has shifted. It's no longer just tiredness, and not only mental overload. It's a feeling of inner lockup, as if choosing has become too dangerous. Psychology shows that when the brain spends enough time avoiding decisions, it relearns the world through avoidance. Choosing stops feeling natural and starts acting as a stress trigger. The mind, which once avoided choices to rest, now avoids them out of fear of spending what little energy is left. At that stage, the person no longer realizes they're protecting themselves. They feel limited, but don't know how to get out of it. Any bigger choice feels overwhelming. Any change sounds threatening. Even things that once brought pleasure begin to demand an emotional effort that feels impossible. And the most delicate part is this. It doesn't happen because the person is weak or unmotivated, but because the mind learned to confuse rest with retreat. What's familiar became shelter. What's new became intrusion. This is where avoiding choices stops being a form of care and starts turning into psychological confinement. The person isn't stuck because they want to be, but because they can't imagine having enough energy to move forward. The world starts to feel smaller, possibilities get dismissed before they're even considered, and life begins to be lived in containment mode. Everything is done to avoid getting worse, but almost nothing is done to truly get better. If you've made it this far, it's because some part of this message touched something that isn't superficial. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel now. Not as an automatic click, but as a signal that you want to keep understanding what's happening inside your mind, without judgment and without ready-made answers. This space is for people who feel too much, think too much, and almost never find the words to explain it. Leave a like on the video as well. It's not just a gesture for the algorithm, it's how this message reaches other people who are living with the same quiet exhaustion and still believe the problem is them. And write a simple, direct phrase in the comments, "I see myself in this," or "My mind is tired." Not to expose yourself, but to mark this moment of awareness. Sometimes saying it out loud already shifts something inside. And if you want to keep going with this reflection, the next video is already on the screen. It goes deeper into the exact point most people avoid looking at, and it might be exactly what you need to hear right now.